Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
When it comes to climate change, there are a bunch of buzzwords that aren't self-explanatory and can be really difficult to understand. You may have heard a couple of these yourself, like net zero, 1.5 degrees, the carbon budget, global warming, and the Paris Agreement. These words have been thrown around more often now that one of the biggest global climate change conferences, called the Conference of Parties, or COP for short, is coming up later this year. The COP is a yearly summit that pushes every nation to reach an agreement on how to tackle climate change. This year, the 26th COP is going to be held in the UK between November 1st and 12th, and it's considered one of the most significant to date because the countries are expected to dedicate more resources into stopping climate change than ever before. But what exactly do these buzzwords around climate change even mean? Why are they important? What difference does climate change make to India, and why should it matter to you? This video aims to answer all of those questions. My name is Simran Sirur and you're watching Tipping Point. In August this year, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released its 6th assessment report on the status of climate change, and the results have been devastating. The IPCC, considered one of the most comprehensive and scientific reports on global warming and climate change, warned that some of the effects of climate change are now irreversible and that human activity had unequivocally contributed to global warming. But among the most worrying findings is that global temperatures are set to rise 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2040. What this means is that from the 1850s, before the Industrial Revolution began, to 2040, global warming will result in a 1.5 degree global rise in temperatures. For perspective, global temperatures have already risen 1.1 degrees since 1850, which explains some of the unusual events the world has seen of late, like the recent floods in Germany, the raging wildfires in California, and out-of-season cyclones here in India. 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like a lot, but here's why it matters. Even though temperatures fluctuate where we live on a daily basis, a global surface temperature depends on how much energy the planet is receiving from the sun and how much it radiates back into space, which NASA's Earth Observatory says changes very little. Over the last few decades, though, this global temperature has been changing rapidly because of an imbalance in the Earth's atmosphere. But more on that later. Scientists measure the Earth's temperature by incorporating surface temperature collected from weather stations, ships, buoys, satellites all across the world. These measurements are observed and analyzed over a long-term average to determine anomalies in global temperatures. A rise or drop in global temperatures of even a few degrees can plunge us into an ice age or scorch the Earth. The IPCC's report is worrying because it says that no matter what we do, a rise of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels is inevitable. This will lead to more extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and melting permafrost. In India, we're more likely to see increased precipitation and more intense and frequent heat waves. So what's causing this imbalance? In short, a disproportionate rise in greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere, which in turn causes the Earth's surface to warm up. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide have been emitted in large volumes and are occupying more space in the atmosphere. There are other greenhouse gases contributing to climate change too, but carbon dioxide is the primary contributor due to human activity. Naturally, sources of atmospheric carbon dioxide include decomposing vegetation and biomass, outgassing by the ocean, volcanic eruptions, and forest fires. This CO2 is absorbed by forests, plants, trees, and the ocean, which are known as carbon sinks and keep the level of CO2 in the atmosphere stable. This recycling of carbon between life, air, water, and earth is called the carbon cycle. But since the 18th century, human activities like the burning of oil, coal, and gas, as well as deforestation, has led to additional sources of carbon dioxide which natural carbon sinks haven't been able to adequately absorb because emissions exceed their capacity to. Since 1850, humans have emitted 2,500 billion tons of carbon dioxide. The US is responsible for 20% of these emissions. China is a distant second, accounting for 11% of total emissions, while India comes 7th, and is responsible for 3.4% of total emissions. Emissions from high-income countries like the US and those in the European Union make up a bulk of historical emissions present in the atmosphere today, because they began industrializing far earlier than low-income or middle-income countries like India. But that also indicates their emissions have peaked, which means their global emissions are now decreasing more than they are increasing. India's emissions haven't yet peaked. We're the third largest emitter of CO2 in the world today, behind China and the US. In 2018, India alone emitted 2,434 million tons of CO2. Historical emissions matter today because of two reasons. One is that higher income nations have developed rapidly to where they are today because of them, while middle and especially low income nations continue to struggle even today but are facing the weight of curbing emissions. Secondly, and more importantly, we are feeling the effects of CO2 emitted decades ago and will feel the effects of today's emissions years from now. The buildup of excess CO2 emissions has already led to a 1.1 degree rise in temperatures. Worryingly, the rate of increase in temperature has been fastest over the last 4 decades, since 1970. The IPCC report warns that in order to limit human-induced global warming, all countries in the world must make deep cuts in emissions down to net zero. So what does net zero mean? Simply put, net zero emissions means balancing the amount of emissions released in the air by humans by getting the gases removed from the atmosphere or absorbed by carbon sinks so that CO2 doesn't accumulate in the atmosphere. This also sets a limit to how much CO2 we can emit in order to keep the goal of 1.5 degrees within reach, called the carbon budget. So far, 86% of this carbon budget has already been usurped. Both the US and China have pledged to become net zero by 2050, a target that India has so far resisted. India argues that since it isn't a historical emitter and since its per capita emissions are only a fraction of what they are in a place like the US, there should be greater pressure on higher income countries to make deep cuts, especially in a short time frame. In the US, each person emits an average of 15.2 metric tons of CO2, while in India that number is just 1.8 metric tons. This isn't to say that India hasn't promised to help reduce climate change at all. In 2015, at the 21st COP, countries decided they would make nationally determined contributions to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, and preferably 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This pact is called the Paris Agreement. As part of the Paris Agreement, India pledged it would reduce its emissions intensity by 33 to 35% below 2005 levels. It also promised to produce 40% of India's power through renewable energy and create a carbon sink capable of absorbing 2.5 billion to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide through additional forest and tree cover. The Paris Agreement is a legally binding document, and it was decided that it would be reviewed every 5 years and revised with a new plan to cut back on emissions and reduce climate change. The upcoming COP, the COP26, is significant because this is the first time that this revision and review will actually happen. India has already increased its renewable energy targets, promising to install 450 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030, and is expected to come up with fresh targets during the COP26.